Welcome back. Let me take us on in the discussion of funding for universities and student fees and just recap some of the main developments that led up to the very political and controversial debates and decisions that led to the current student fees regime that we're all living with. So, between 1830 and up to the First World War in 1914, as we talked about, there was a small increase in the number of universities created based on fees and private endowments, often from philanthropists, some of whom had made their money in the Industrial Revolution. The first Treasury grant was actually in 1889, £15,000 to be divided among all the universities of the day. And as we discussed, a wider range of study, particularly in some of the science and technology subjects, was becoming much more common, particularly across the new universities of the Midlands and Northern England. And there was a wider basis for entry into those universities, particularly in the new prosperous middle class. The needs of the economy and society meant that for the first time in the 1889 grant, the government, the state, was beginning to see a purpose for itself, limited though the state was of the day, in promoting university education as an essential underpinning for a more modern economy, as we would see it, and to support the ambitions of the middle class, whose political support the governments were looking for. And although by 1910 the Treasury grant had risen tenfold to £150,000, this was still, even at the time, a very small amount of money for what was effectively supporting the entire university sector across the country. So it had been a very slow rate of progress over the 70, 80 years from the foundations of the first universities after Oxford and Cambridge up to World War I. And between the wars, we saw state spending double, but as we reflected on earlier, actually the growth in universities was still extremely slow in this period. The balance changed slightly between the role of fees paid by individuals and state funding through taxation. And you recall the University Grants Committee had been set up in 1919 to deal with the very poor financial state of the universities after World War I. There was some attempt to provide more systematic focus on funding, particularly for some poorer students, to improve access. And through the 1930s, as we noted, around half of students received small amounts of financial support for fees and or for living costs. Often, though, this was somewhat ad hoc, based on where they came from, an individual, village or town or community, where there might be some form of scholarship or bursary available for those few individuals who might make it to university. And although not everyone outside the upper and middle classes was entirely excluded from university, the numbers achieving entrance remained very low. And between the period of the 1820s and 1945 that we were reflecting on for over a century, it was very incremental, very gradual, very slow growth. And there was no real commitment at that stage to see a significant or rapid expansion in access to universities, which would have demanded a more strategic approach to the funding of university places and the financial support for individuals to take up those places. As we've already touched upon, after 1945, there were huge changes in social policy across many parts of the UK economy and society. And through the Robbins Report and the Anderson Report, social policy changed most significantly to create an entitlement to access to university education if you had the ability to benefit from it, and the right to be supported in it through mandatory grants. Local education authorities, LEAs, paid the fees to the universities and also in many cases provided grants for living costs. And that increased access and the greatly increased numbers meant there was a wholly new approach needed to funding and fees. Effectively through that period, the cost of university fees shifted pretty well entirely from individual students supported in an ad hoc way in some bursary or philanthropic manner, to the state providing the funding through general taxation. Funding of living costs became prevalent to ensure that access for increasing numbers of people from different parts of society. In other words, you did not have to come from an upper class or middle class family who had the resources to support you at university. The state would provide that support through living costs funding. And this all reflected in the 30 odd years that followed after the war the broad consensus on a range of social policy and politics that the country should be opening up, that access and opportunities should be made available to people which had only been reserved for the very few up to then. And as we saw, we did see in this period some gradual increase in the numbers of people attending university, from perhaps 5% in 1950 through to 60, to around 11% in 1980 and 19% in 1990. I went up to university in 1980. I was therefore part of that 11%. It was certainly better than it had been, but it was hardly the important and universal access that we now almost take for granted, that everyone should have that opportunity if at all possible. And I was one of the fortunate number who had not only my fees paid by the local education authority, but because of my parents' low income, I received a grant to support my living costs. It's worth bearing in mind, perhaps, that I know you all find yourself in a very different position, as my son does, just how much things have changed across a generation, that many people whose parents perhaps had that support and underwriting of the costs now face a very different situation for their own children. And in part that's driven by a view on funding and the role of the state, but it's also, as we've been reflecting, very much driven by the ambition of having far greater numbers of people accessing university education. And to have maintained those numbers while having no fees paid by the individual and providing living cost support through taxation came to be recognised as an impossible ambition. So governments had to make a choice as to where they wanted to be in terms of the amount of taxation to support the sector, how many students that would mean in terms of admissions, and how far they wanted to extend access into the future so that we were achieving the sort of student numbers we're seeing today. So over a very important 20-year period between 1979 and 1998, there were long, controversial and complex debates about how university education should be approached in future. And I picked 1979 very deliberately, of course, the first election victory for Margaret Thatcher, the election of a somewhat different Conservative government than we'd seen in the past. Keith Joseph became Secretary of State for Education, one of Mrs. Thatcher's very closest intellectual advisors, and he produced a green paper on the development of higher education into the 1990s. And that essentially concluded that the costs of the existing policies on universities had spiralled as demand increased and as funding couldn't keep up. And it meant that funding per head, that the amount of money provided to universities for each student, had dropped by 40% over the previous decade or so. And since university income came over 90% from the state, i.e. from taxpayers, this had huge implications for the quality of education that universities could provide. Yes, some more people were getting into university places, but the amount of money available to support them and the amount of money universities had and the resources that could be provided for the teaching and support for those students, as I say, had almost halved. And these were not sustainable positions. Something had to change. Universities themselves, because they were virtually entirely dependent on the state and taxpayer income, had perhaps become complacent about spending and costs. And there was a sense, which I can remember myself at the time, of that the fall in per head funding put huge pressures on the quality and quantity of provision, and a sense that university education was not what it used to be. We had seen more than 75 new universities created and later adapted from previous institutions to meet the demands for numbers, There was a much wider variety of subjects and courses available. And you may well know the conversion of polytechnics in 1992 towards university status was a very significant widening of choice and variety in the sector. The difference between the number of courses available perhaps when I went to university in 1980 and 10, 20 years later, let alone today, is vast. There was a much wider choice that individuals could make about the institutions they wanted to attend and the sort of courses that they wanted to undertake. All of this, of course, is incredibly positive, but it was impossible to imagine that continuing and the quality being sustained and the financial model that was currently in operation. So various governments initially responded by making small steps. Maintenance grants, the money paid for living expenses, became means tested and then was turned into loans. Inevitably, this started to put pressure on access for some parts of society, just at a time when demand from different classes, different individuals was starting to grow. The Deering report on the National Committee of Inquiry into Higher Education was commissioned by John Major's government after he had succeeded Margaret Thatcher, but was actually delivered to Tony Blair after 1997, when Labour had won a landslide general election victory. Various options were put forward at the time: loans, a graduate tax, deferred payment, means testing for all. And in the Labour manifesto of that 1997 election, it stated that the costs of maintenance, living expenses, should be repaid through a graduate tax. Important to bear in mind in thinking about what happened subsequently, that the politics of New Labour, as it had been rechristened by Blair, Brown and Mandelson at the time, positioned the late New Labour government of 1997 more as the heirs to Thatcherism, perhaps, than the heirs to socialism. It had been felt that Labour had to show to people that it had the same level of responsibility to tax and spend as Conservative governments. That was seen as crucial to securing the landslide victory of 1997. But that meant they were going to approach decisions on university funding and on student fees much more in the same mindset that a Conservative government might have done than a Labour government led, for example, by someone like Jeremy Corbyn. So the Labour government introduced student fees in 1998 at £1,000 a year in the Teaching and Higher Education Act. Grants were replaced by means-tested loans, and although a third of students would still pay nothing, many more, of course, would start to pay fees at £1,000 a year for the first time. I'm going to stop there and resume in a few moments.